Hello, and welcome to Henri's Bookshelf, a podcast produced by the Henri Nouwen Society. I'm Wendy VanderWal Martin, and I'm so excited to bring you engaging and encouraging conversations about Henri Nouwen's books that'll make you want to pick it up and read it again, or maybe read it for the very first time. And I'm thrilled to bring you these conversations from Henri's library, housed here at the Cedars at L'Arche Daybreak. Welcome, friends, to a new episode of Henri's Bookshelf, produced by the Henri Nouwen Society. My name is Wendy VanderWal Martin, and I'm grateful to be your host and grateful to have our guest with us today. We are looking at a book that Henri Nouwen wrote in 1975, now with the lighting, maybe you don't see it, called Reaching Out. This is one of the canon of Henri Nouwen that's sort of a staple. It's right in there with the must reads that people have maybe long-time memories of reading. I read it again just this week in preparation for this conversation and was just stunned again at how timeless Henri's words are. You know, I'm tempted to call Henri relevant, but he said a lot about not being relevant. But the prophetic witness of Henri Nouwen in this book, Reaching Out, the three movements of the spiritual life, are astounding. And I'm thrilled to have a conversation about the book with the Reverend Kyle Norman, who is an Anglican priest in Kamloops, BC, at the St. Paul's Cathedral. So Kyle, welcome. Thrilled to have you here.
Well, the thrill is all mine. As I said before, when we were just chatting, I've been a follower of the Henri Nouwen Society for years. And so I am just very excited to be talking with you, Wendy, and on this podcast.
Well, welcome. Tell us how you encountered Henri Nouwen. That's always a great place to begin. How did you find yourself interacting?
Yeah. There's really two stories about that, So I've been ordained for around 22 years. And when I was in seminary, I entered seminary, it was 2000. And I didn't know anything about Henri Nouwen at all. But I would see some of my classmates just carrying around some of his books. And so I thought, okay, this is somebody I should read. And so I picked up Return of the Prodigal Son and honestly read the first chapter and thought, meh, and put it down and left it for probably about 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and never really engaged it. I just kind of thought, okay, whatever. Fast forward 15 years, and my ministry kind of evolved, and I grew, and really found myself ministering in the field of spiritual formation. And in that growth, was reintroduced to Henri Nouwen. And one of the first things that I read was Reaching Out. And it just kind of peeled back the layers of everything that I was trying to figure out and trying to preach and teach about, but sometimes lacked the words to describe. And now it just does a wonderful job of doing that plainly and succinctly. And that just really began my journey with Henri Nouwen. And I've just been a reader of his, an advocate of hers, a follower of his since that time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, I understand that you're offering a course on spirituality that has a significant focus on reaching out. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. So Kamloops is situated right by the Shuswap and Lake Shuswap, and there's a retreat center and a camp there called the Sorrento Center. And my diocese has a lot to do with that center. And I was talking to the executive director, and he said, we'd love to have you come out and offer something. And we were talking, and we got onto the topic of Henri Nouwen. And I just said, I just wonder if something like the spirituality of Henri Nouwen would be of interest. And he just kind of lit up and said, that would be amazing. And so we kind of booked that. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do, reaching out came to the fore. And so I'm basing this course as a spirituality of Henri Nouwen. I'm calling it the four ways to be God's beloved. And
Mm,
so it's really based on reaching out, the inward, outward, and upward movements. To that, I'm adding a downward movement because following this, Henri Nouwen really talks a lot about downward mobility, which
right.
doesn't necessarily show up all that often in reaching out,
Mhm,
but becomes a pretty significant thing for now. And so I wanted to include that. But 90% of what we're going to be talking about is taken from reaching out the three movements of the spiritual life, which is just a wonderful way to articulate what we can think about when we want to live the spiritual life more intentionally and authentically.
mhm. Yeah, Henry wrote Reaching Out in 1975. So downward mobility perhaps wasn't really part of his motif at that time. But we know, of course, he spent the last 10 years of his life at L'Arche Daybreak in Richmond Hill. And that was very much the embodied incarnational expression of that idea
Yeah,
of downward mobility. So uh, we will put information about Kyle's course in the show notes. Uh,
lovely. Yeah.
and I think that sounds like an exciting journey for people to
Mhm.
go inward, to go outward, to go upward, and then also to take the
Go downward.
path of
Yeah.
descent, as some of the ancient fathers taught us. Well, we're going to dive right into talking about
Sure.
reaching out. Uh, as I've said already, it was 1975. I don't know how old you were, Kyle, but I was,
I was not even thought of in 1975.
well, I was the ripe old age of 5 years old, and
Okay.
Henry wrote this: the contemporary society in which we find ourselves makes us acutely aware of our loneliness. We become increasingly aware that we are living in a world where even the most intimate relationships have become part of competition and rivalry. Our culture has become most sophisticated in the avoidance of pain, not only our physical pain, but our emotional and mental pain as well. We have become so used to this state of anesthesia that we panic when there is nothing or nobody left to distract us. And, Henry wrote this before a 24-hour news cycle or smartphones at our fingertips, or even having multiple screens going on at the same time. How critical is it that we hear Henry's words related to loneliness, the way we try to avoid pain? And he talks about it as a suffocating loneliness that
Yeah.
becomes a significant barrier in our spiritual life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think previously you used the word prophetic, and I think that's what we really need to recognize. Um, Nouwen was so prophetic in and how he was able to understand the movements of life and this sense of loneliness and preoccupation and busyness that was present in 1975, but has just been ramped to the nth degree in 2025. Um, and because of that, his words describing the effect that it has on our souls, on our spiritual lives, can just um, it just rings so true. I was thinking the other day, like, I wonder what would Henry Nouwen have done with text messages? It was just kind of, you know, this kind of constant availability, which sometimes he found himself in the trap of. He would call up his friends at all hours of the evening when he wanted to connect. Um, but he also recognized the danger of that. And
Mhm.
so when we are wanting to recognize how do we take a further step in our spiritual life? Um, that has to impact how we address the things of the world, and how we navigate the things of the world, like preoccupation, like busyness, um, like the constant distractions that are always around us, that deafen us to the movements of the Spirit and the presence of God within us. And so I think returning in some sense to Henri Nouwen, even 1975 Henri Nouwen, is a great place to start, because he's able in such a prophetic way just put his finger on what is the heart of the issue that we need to recognize, which is, well, he says, this movement from loneliness to solitude.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's hard to believe that Lent is around the corner as we're recording this. I'm not sure when it will be released, but I know more and more people who are fasting from social media or texting or screens or media that comes through screens as a way of saying, for my spiritual health,
Yeah,
as a discipline in the season of Lent, I am going to set those things aside. Uh, and we know that people are more connected and have more online friends than ever, but are more desperately lonely and
yeah,
feeling a deep disconnection in that intimate place within themselves that really matters. And this movement that Henri's speaking about, this movement inwards, reaching to ourselves, our truest self,
yeah,
that the many distractions actually keep us from the kind of examine that would understand our deep self. How do you see that as a parish priest, as someone who's serving a congregation of people? How do you see people grappling and struggling with that,
yeah,
knowing that these things make us more lonely and yet we're still drawn into them?
absolutely. It's such a trap, and I think, I've I often see people and they'll give up, social media, or they'll give up TV. One of the things that now one talks about, is that we don't respond loneliness to loneliness, right? Like, so if solitude isn't just stepping away from the bells and whistles and just thinking, if I turn everything off, then that's going to be okay. um, you can still be lonely and just be silent, right? Like, that doesn't actually address the inward things. Nouwen talks about solitude as kind of a stepping into. You step into yourselves, but you also step into this place where this, he talks about holy ground. You create this holy ground where you can receive God and the voice of God that calls you the beloved. And that's how we return to ourselves. And so we have to understand, Lenten disciplines are fabulous. And turning off social media is wonderful. But if we're not using that as a way to step into and open up ourselves to the presence of God that declares who we fundamentally are as the beloved children of God, um, then we might just continually rest in this loneliness, which leads to, he talks about spastic reactions, and always the attempt to try to fill that loneliness,
Mhm.
rather than recognizing that our life is already filled with the affirmations and the presence of God with us.
Yeah, he says it so beautifully in reaching out. A man or woman who has developed this solitude of heart is no longer pulled apart by the most divergent stimuli of the
Yeah,
surrounding world, but is able to perceive and understand this world from a quiet inner center. And so it's not just about being quiet, as you say, it's not just about being in solitude the way we might think about pulling away and alone, but it is this deep inner quiet that is grounded in our belovedness, that
yeah,
is nourished in that deep place. Now,
And you can have that surrounded by people. And you can have that in the mall or at your work and all that stuff, but it becomes the basis from which you live, and you take that inner quietness with you, that solitude with you into the world. And then that anesthesia, that busyness, that distractions, those begin to lessen as we begin to live our lives from the standpoint of this solitude, of this spiritual life.
now, Kyle, you and I are both preachers, and so was Henry. And we know that we often preach larger than our own lives. And Henry himself certainly taught larger than his life. And he speaks about that in the foreword to this book, and yet feeling deeply that he was to offer this gift. And so, how do you, as someone who's, I'm sure, in a very busy parish, the demands on the life of a parish priest are extraordinary in these days. How are you living into solitude yourself? And how do you help the very busy people in your parish make that movement in just really concrete and practical ways, recognizing that we don't get it perfect. We don't have it, settled and we've arrived.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things I try to remind myself of, and remind other people of, that when we think about and any spiritual discipline, solitude or prayer or whatever it is, that we do the disciplines as we can, not as we can't. All right. And so by that, I mean, like, if we think, okay, like, I'm just going to, every day I need to have 20 minutes of solitude, and that's going to be my special time. And well, we're going to work ourselves into condemnation, right? Because the 10 minutes of solitude that we spend is only going to testify to the 20 minutes that we didn't spend in solitude, and all that stuff. And so it's easy to kind of take that condemnation upon yourself. And so I try to remind myself that, in my life and in my work and in the business of whatever I have to deal with as life today, how do I take that right now in this place and recognize that I am called to be nobody else than who I am in this moment, and I am called to be nowhere else than where I am in this moment, and I am not alone because God is with me. And if I can just quiet myself down enough, even in that place, even just take a couple moments of breath, then I'm able to hopefully reframe that freneticness that sometimes I so often can feel, and I think other people feel.
I think Henry often also talked about we want our practice to feel successful. So we want
Yeah,
this experience of, connecting to our innermost self, or in the third movement, Henry will speak about prayer. And yet a lot of spiritual practice is waiting. It
yeah,
is, or as Henry would say, wasting time with God.
yeah.
Um, and the actual journey of sort of the absence of God, or the absence of connecting to my innermost self, and yet waiting nonetheless, strengthens some muscles in us that, you know, we may be surprised down the road at the ways it bears spiritual fruit.
Yeah.
Uh, when it felt like we were doing it wrong, or, it wasn't having the results that we had hoped it would, that the persistence
Yeah.
in waiting in and of itself does
Mhm.
bear fruit.
Absolutely. And he talks a lot about, we're not called to be successful, we're called to be fruitful, right? We're called to enter into something that produces life. And waiting can be active. It can be something that it's something that we do, um, which produces a richer life. But our identity and our rootedness in our spiritual life um, isn't based on what we do. It's not based on if people speak well of us. It's not based on what we have. Like he talks about this so many different places. Um, and so if we are able just to stop the doing, right,
Mhm.
and receive, um, it does reframe us, right? It does help us move inward. And then as we move inward, we naturally begin to move outward and upward.
Indeed. And so the book Reaching Out is about three movements of the spiritual life. The first is from loneliness to solitude. And then Henry moves us to go from hostility to hospitality. And this is how he describes it: the movement by which our hostilities can be converted into hospitality. It is there that our changing relationship to ourself, where we've reached into that innermost part of our being, can be brought to fruition, or as Henry would say, fruition, in an ever-changing relationship to our fellow human beings. It's there that our reaching out to our innermost being can lead to a reaching out to the many strangers whom we meet on our way through life. Now, he unpacks it not only in the sense of strangers, as in someone we don't even know, but he speaks about some very key relationships: children and parents, students and teachers, uh, and patients and helpers, those in the helping and caring profession. Now, how do you think that hostility is manifesting today? And in what ways do you most see that hospitality being embodied by people who are following these movements of
Sure.
spiritual
Yeah,
life?
yeah. Um, hostility is such a really, I think, a good word,
Mm.
because sometimes we don't recognize the hostilities, or we just think, oh no, we just like things our way. Like he talks about one of the things about we when we welcome the strangers, that we welcome them on their terms, not on ours. So we don't say, as long as you believe the way that I believe, as long as you think the way that I think, as long as you do what I, well, then I will receive you. But so often that can be like he would say that's hostile. Um, and that's so often the way that things can work. Um, I'm in a church, and I think everybody who works in a church, probably, we use pews in our church, but everybody probably knows the scenario of asking a visitor to move seat because that's my pew, right? And like I think Nouwen would say that's hostile, right?
Mm.
That's not about receiving the person on their terms. What you're saying is, well, you can come as long as you recognize that I have to sit where I want to sit, or I have to sing the songs that I want to sing, and all this kind of stuff. And so, in so many subtle ways, like wanting to always sit in the same spot, that can kind of drive people away. But when we are rooted in in ourselves, in our belovedness, which comes from the recognition of Jesus, and Jesus welcoming the stranger and loving the enemy and blessing the persecutor, then we naturally find kind of a deep reservoir within ourselves to move in that direction and to maybe sit in a different spot, right? Like as ludicrous as that might sound, but I think these are some of the ways that it practically works out in our lives. It can work out in big ways, like mission trips, and Henry went on a mission trip, and these big movements. But it can also work out in these small movements of just embracing a visitor or a stranger or a loved one, not for what they bring into our lives, not for how they bolster us up, but for who they are, and as a way to bless and love them.
Yeah, I think this is a time that there's a lot of turmoil and even chaos,
Mhm.
uh, culturally, politically. Uh, we are Canadians, and
Yep.
currently there's a lot of talk about, becoming a 51st state. I live in a border town and
Mhm.
literally look out my window as I'm recording this out at the country of which some people would want to take
Sure.
Canada for their own. So I kind of want to slow down the conversation for a moment because I think we can think about an example like, I should give up my preferred place in church,
Sure. Yeah.
or we can talk about issues of privilege,
Yeah.
and many of us are learning and growing and catching up with some of that. Um, but I think many of us are also faced with ideologies and um, actions that are really frightening
Sure.
or threatening.
Yep.
And the work, Henri doesn't use nonviolence,
Sure.
particularly in reaching out, although he makes reference to Martin Luther King and others who embodied a very different way. And the reality is, there aren't simple answers to how to embody hospitality
Yeah.
and relinquish our hostility when we perhaps are feeling threatened in a way we haven't felt threatened before.
Yeah.
I'm not only speaking of Canadians, but there are
Sure.
powers in the world today, um, over which we may deeply disagree with people who have been longtime friends or family members. And we're trying to find a way
Yeah.
to make
Yeah.
this shift from hostility to hospitality.
Yeah.
And again, Henri's prophetic witness is so significant, but Henri also says we don't always get it. We aspire, we are
Yeah.
reminded, we are called to this prophetic witness.
Yeah.
Um, but I think we need to acknowledge in this conversation, Kyle, how difficult it is, how painful it is,
Yeah.
how hard it is to go from an understanding in our head of moving from the house of fear to the house of love, and then actually doing it in the face of situations that overwhelm us, that are
Sure.
far too
Yeah.
big for us to fix or to solve. And embracing pain
Yeah.
is part of these movements that Henri's speaking about.
Well, and one of the things that I love that Henri Nouwen does here, um, in reaching out, like talking about hospitality, talking about embracing others, um, moving from hostility, like it's not a Pollyanna kind of thing. Um, and nor is it kind of this heightened mystical thing that lacks any sort of relevance to our world. Nouwen's not talking about kind of giving ourselves away. One of the things that I love that he talks about, and where he's talking about reaching out to others, he talks about the power of confrontation,
And
um,
boundaries.
right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that he says is when we want to be really hospitable, we not only have to receive strangers, but also to confront them by an unambiguous presence, not hiding ourselves behind neutrality, but showing our ideas, opinions, and lifestyle clearly and distinctly. And so, this call to love, this call to move outwards, this call to embrace, um, we don't lose ourselves in it. It has to be rooted in who we are, and that this is where the pain can come from, and this is where I think um, sometimes the deaths come from, right, where we recognize that no, um, I receiving another doesn't mean that, he says in the inner voice of love, that we just don't become public property. Like we own ourselves and we are rooted in who we are. And that's part of the strength of reaching inward, so that we can then bear those confrontations, um, lovingly and peacefully and nonviolently. Um, but we do stand strong in who we are. And I think that has to be an important, and I love that he brings that in there because it can so easy be swept into, oh, just love one another and everything will work out.
Yeah. Well, and the extraordinary courage that it takes to enact what Henri writes about.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
that we deal with matters bigger than ourselves. We feel inadequate. We have traumas we deal with, and
yeah,
so this movement, first in this reaching inward, then reaching outward, it's so crucial that we keep moving as Henri takes us. But before we get to the third movement, I wanted to come to this particular paradoxical statement that Henri makes, which is that poverty makes a good host.
yeah,
And he goes on to unpack it as a poverty of the mind and a poverty of the heart. Now, none of us want to be poor. Let's just face it. None of us want to
sure,
be
exactly. Yeah,
powerless. We don't want to be weak. We don't want to feel like we're beholden to others. And so unpack that for us a little bit, Kyle. What is Henri actually saying when he says poverty makes a great host? That poverty of mind and poverty of heart.
yeah, yeah. That would be one thing that I never, I never fully would have gotten, until I until I walked through a really difficult time.
Mm.
So, and I write about this um, in Alive, Loved, and Free. But there was this moment where I was really struggling in my parish. My wife was going through a cancer journey, and my spiritual life just turned upside down. And I had developed this sense of I need to have everything in control, right? Because I'm the priest, right? Like, what are people going to think of me if I don't have the answers and if I'm struggling and if I'm having a hard time praying and all this kind of stuff? Um, and one of the gifts of, we reach out to the community, but the community also reaches out to us. And, I got really good at saying fine to everybody who said, how are you doing? I'm fine. But when somebody kind of pushed past that, I got to this moment where I just had to trust that if somebody wanted to help and were asking me, how am I doing? That I have to trust that they really want to know and they really want to help. And so poverty in that way for me, it means about just dropping my bravado, dropping my ego, um, and being willing to receive the gift of the other people, right? Um, and to being willing to receive the gift of this community member who asked to help in a certain way. And so, you know, and I think, you know, that makes me a better priest. That makes me a better husband. It makes me a better father. It makes me a better Christian, right? So when we are able to recognize that, you know what, it's not all about, I don't have to have everything myself. And maybe what God wants to do in me is actually coming through you. And if I am able just to, release my hands and just drop my stuff so that I can receive what is coming to me, um, then I move deeper into my life with God. Then I receive the gift that God's giving me through you, um, and um, and as Henri said, that's what it means to be a good host, right? Uh, Not to call the shots and demand everything around me.
Mhm. Yes, thank you. I think we all have our own journey to discover what our own poverty of the heart and poverty of the
Yeah,
mind is, but it is this openness
Yeah.
this ability to be receptive,
Mhm.
even across difference, and not lose ourselves, but
Yeah.
be alert to the gift that might surprise us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, you know, people who read Reaching Out the first time might be a little curious about the order. Why do we reach into ourselves and then
Sure.
reach out to others? And then, oh, finally, we reach out to God in the third movement from illusion to prayer.
Sure.
But Henry talks about that and he says these movements are first only in the sense that they are more quickly recognizable and easier to identify with, not because they are more important. In fact, they could only be described and reflected upon because they are rooted in the most basic movement of the spiritual life, which is the movement from illusion to
Yeah.
prayer. It is through this movement that we reach out to God.
Yeah.
And he calls prayer the core of the
Yeah.
spiritual life.
Mhm.
Now, how have you, he talks about how this notion of illusion is a little hard to explain or describe. How have you experienced illusions sort of distracting you from prayer? And what are some really tangible things that you've done to address that in your own life?
Sure. Yeah. I think some of the illusions that, well, I think a lot of the illusions that I've wrestled with, um, because I am a priest and preacher, and I think a lot of the illusions have to deal with my own competency, right?
Mm.
Like that. Well, I know what to do, and I know how to pray in this situation. I know what to say. I know all of this kind of stuff. I know how to read the Bible, and so it can be easy then to do my prayers, rushing through whatever it is, thinking, okay, I've done that. That's great. Or read the Bible, begin, I read the chapter in 5 minutes and I'm done and I'm good. Um, for me, part of the illusion is getting it done, right? Kind of that successful kind of thing. Can I be successful in saying my prayer? Can I be successful in reading the Bible? Can I be successful in preaching the sermon? Um, and peeling back the layers and saying, no, this isn't about success. This is about fruitfulness. This isn't about information. This is about formation. Who are you being formed into? How are you growing? And so the practical steps for me is to try to engage these places of my spiritual life, whatever it might be, fasting, worship, scripture reading, all of these kind of things, to uh, to approach that not from the stance of I know what to do, but to be more contemplative, meditative, be a little bit more slow in this process. Now, in time wise, if I read the Bible slowly, it only actually takes me like an additional 2 minutes to read the passage. So I'm not like I don't lose a lot of time, but it just slows me down so that I can be present. And I think that's kind of a big thing, is being present in this moment with this activity of prayer or scripture reading or whatever it might be, so that I can hear and I can feel God around me, and I can hear the presence and the voice of God as God speaks in the silences and in the listenings or in the words that I'm reading. Um, if I try to muscle my way through it and say, I will do this, I will do this, I will do this, then it becomes more something on my own strength rather than receiving the gift of God in this place, in this moment.
Hmm, thank you. It strikes me that so much of the church is polarized today. And something that Henri spends quite a bit of time talking about is our images of God,
Mhm.
our sense of we've got God figured out. And um, and we tend to be in our own echo chambers. We listen to the other folks who speak about theology and the spiritual life and ethics, etc., who agree with us. And so our sense of who God is gets reinforced continuously in that
Yeah.
particular arena. And, we glibly talk about iron sharpening iron at times, but truly, uh, in what ways do you think uh, making space to be in deep, sustained dialogue with brothers and sisters who are grappling with things differently
Yeah.
than we are around interpretation or ethics or whatever? I feel like there's sort of a fatigue in a lot of denominations and local
Sure.
churches, even, that say, we did that. We've done it. We bought the t-shirt. We're done with
Yep.
that. We need to get on with it and kind of hang out with our folks. But in what ways might we be unknowingly contributing to a certain illusion of what God is like?
I think that's a big thing. Um, and so I write a lot on what I call spiritual discouragement, and this sense that largely, and I think in churches today, we don't allow that dialogue to occur, right? And to sit in the the pain and the struggling. And so as a priest and as a pastor, like I've received a lot of I've talked with people, and so many people think that if I'm struggling in prayer, that somehow I'm doing it wrong, right? And the problem is me, right? And sometimes that gets reinforced by you just need to pray harder, or if you're going through a hard time, then it's okay. Well, we're just going to pray, and that hard time is going to get removed from you. Wait, no, like that's the beauty of our faith is that we understand a God who doesn't necessarily always remove us from the hardships of life, but dwells in the hardships with us. And so if we would build the capacity to be able to say, hey, I'm really struggling, or I have this question, and not address it with, easy sound bites and rote answers, and all that kind of stuff, then we will actually grow our capacity to hear what God says to us in those moments and to receive the gift of love in those moments. Um, and again, like I wouldn't have known this when my wife was going through cancer. I would have a lot of people say to me, you know, don't worry, Kyle. God's not picking on her. He's hand picking her. And I thought, wait, like, sure, that kind of sound. We're just gonna pray the pain away. No, wait, like let's peel back the layers a little bit. Like those become band-aids that we put on a situation to make us feel better, so we don't have to deal with the ugliness that is before us, or the questions, or the hurt. But we worship a God who takes that ugliness and hurt upon himself, right? And so being willing to dwell in that place and not explain it away, not, you know, but to actually talk about it and to engage it and to recognize, well, where is God in this? And even just ask the questions and to yell and to scream and do all that kind of stuff. That's actually how we reach out to God. Um, you know, Believing that we can't do that is an illusion that actually keeps God a little bit at bay.
Yeah. Yeah. My friend Bradley Jerzak speaks of a
Mm,
co-suffering God.
absolutely. Yeah.
Now, one of the risks of doing a podcast like this is that we're in some ways giving sound bites of a
Yeah,
book that is so rich.
sure.
And
Yeah.
so we hope that this conversation is a bit like an hors d'oeuvre,
Yeah.
that it will compel you to either pick it up and read it for the first time or read it again, reaching out the three movements of the spiritual life. Um, Henry speaks about three aspects of prayer that we can practice when we feel like we don't know how to pray. Uh, One is the contemplative reading of scripture. Some of us know that as Lectio Divina. And if you look up Lectio Divina through your Google tools, you'll find some very simple guides on how to engage in contemplative reading of scripture. We have a new series of daily meditations this year that I compiled from maybe slightly different sources than have typically been used for the daily meditations. And I designed it so that people would read them as a form of Lectio Divina. They're shorter and they're not meant to educate, they're
Mhm.
meant to make space for God, to read contemplatively. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to make space for God. And again, Henry speaks about wasting time with God, which he both was deeply committed to and also not very good at. He
Oh,
talks
sure.
about monkeys jumping
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah,
tree,
yeah, yeah.
right? Uh, and then thirdly, he speaks about having a spiritual guide. Now, that may or may not be a spiritual director, someone who's has the qualifications of a spiritual director. But what I always think is slightly ironic about the title spiritual director is that they're not directive.
Sure.
They are there to accompany and to invite you to listen to God, to be curious with you about what God might be saying. Now, Kyle, how have you found those three intermingling practices helpful for you?
They've been immensely helpful. I I love Lectio Divina. It's just that kind of that slow, repetitive movement of scripture. I remember the first time I ever tried it. It was it was transformative, right? Like, you know, and because I was reading something that, um, obviously I've read before, but it was like in those movements of, meditating on it and thinking, okay, so what is Jesus saying to me in this? Really started to feel that, hey, this text is actually addressing me. I'm not reading it, it's reading me, right? And so that was just a really kind of and again, that slowing down and not rushing. Oh, I know this parable. Let's move on, right? The slowing down and reading it, and with ears that are open to hear possibly what God might be using this passage to speak into our lives, um, in a way which is not just about can I answer the Bible trivia, but can I see how this applies? I think that's fabulous. I've had a spiritual director previously, particularly in that hard year. I had a spiritual director I talked to uh, a lot.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, like it's just um, it's so important. I think in terms of um, re- you know cultivating these things in our lives in the ways that they fit most organically, right? So there has been a time where I spend a little bit more time with Lectio, and then there was a time where I spend a little bit more time with a spiritual director. And now I don't have a director per se, but I have people that I call for mentorship and say, hey, like I'm struggling with this. Um, because if we fully believe that we exist in a community and that God uses community to speak into our lives, then we need to allow that community to have voice through sacred readings, through building in these solitude, these places of prayer, but also these conversations with holy guides that we can kind of have to affirm us and to encourage us, and yes, even to challenge us if we need to be challenged. in a loving, peaceful way.
The book is Reaching Out, the 3 movements of the spiritual life. One of the things that Henri speaks about is the prayer of the heart, and does a wonderful description of that prayer going from our mind and our language and our mouth into our very being. And so again, such a rich staple within the Henri Nouwen canon, if you would. We encourage you to pick it up, read it. Thank you, Reverend Kyle, for being with us for this rich conversation. And friends, thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us and wanting to dig into a spiritual life that is relinquishing the loneliness, the hostility, and the illusions for a life of authentic vulnerability, a poverty of the heart that makes space for God. And so, friends, I remind myself as I remind you, never, ever, ever forget you are the beloved of God. If you enjoyed this episode of Henri's Bookshelf, a podcast produced by the Henri Nouwen Society, then leave us a review or a thumbs up, share it with family and friends, subscribe to our YouTube channel or another podcast platform, and head over to henrinouwen.org. Sign up for our free daily meditations, or consider giving us a donation that would help support programs like this one to share the spiritual wisdom of Henri Nouwen right around the world. Thanks so much for being with us.